When my dad announced that everything in his will was going to my stepmom's daughter, my heart stopped. Years of loyalty, of sacrifices, of being the good daughter, and this was how it ended. At that moment, sitting in his study, I realized the man I thought I knew didn't see me as his daughter anymore, just an afterthought in someone else's life. It had started with a casual family dinner, or so I thought. My stepmom, Julia, had prepared her signature roast, and her daughter, Chloe, was chattering away about her upcoming graduation party, all paid for by Dad, of course. I tried to focus on my meal, but Julia's pointed glances in my direction told me something was coming. After dinner, Dad asked me to stay behind. "We need to discuss something important," he said, his tone serious. My heart sank. I followed him to his study, where he closed the door and gestured for me to sit. "I've made some decisions about the will," he began, his voice steady but devoid of emotion. "Julia and I have agreed that it's only fair for Chloe to inherit the house and the majority of the estate. She's younger, and she'll need the support." I stared at him, stunned. "What about me?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. "You'll get a small trust," he said, as if that would soften the blow. "But Sarah, you're independent. You've got a good job, and you've always been self-sufficient. Chloe doesn't have that yet." The room felt like it was closing in on me. "So, I'm being punished for being responsible?" I asked, the bitterness seeping into my voice. "For building a life on my own, while you've handed everything to her?" Dad sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not about punishment, Sarah. It's about fairness." Fairness. That word hung in the air like a cruel joke. This wasn't fairness. It was betrayal. I had spent my life trying to make him proud, and now I was being pushed aside for someone who wasn't even his daughter by blood. I left the study that night with a storm brewing inside me. If Dad thought I'd just accept this quietly, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The next morning, I woke up with the weight of my father's words pressing down on me. The idea that Chloe, someone who had only been in our lives for a few years, would inherit everything felt like a cruel twist of fate. Growing up, I had always thought my hard work and dedication would mean something. Now, it seemed like it had all been for nothing. At breakfast, Julia was already seated at the table, sipping her coffee. Chloe sat beside her, scrolling on her phone with a smug smile that made my stomach churn. I could feel their eyes on me as I walked into the room. "Good morning, Sarah," Julia said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Did you sleep well?" I forced a tight smile. "As well as one can after being told they don't matter in their own family." Julia's smile faltered for a moment before she regained her composure. "Oh, Sarah, don't be dramatic. Your father made a decision that's best for everyone. Chloe has a bright future ahead of her and she'll need all the support she can get." Chloe finally looked up from her phone. "Don't take it personally, Sarah. It's just logical, you know? I'm still figuring things out, and you're so established. You don't really need anything." The condescension in her tone made my blood boil. I gritted my teeth, biting back the words I wanted to throw at her. Instead, I turned to Julia. "Logical? That's an interesting way to justify favoritism." Julia set her coffee cup down with a sharp clink. "This isn't favoritism. It's about priorities. Your father and I have discussed this at length, and we believe it's the right thing to do." I could feel the walls of the kitchen closing in around me, the weight of their words pressing harder with every passing second. It wasn't just about the will. It was about how they saw me, as someone who didn't belong, someone who could be cast aside without a second thought. "Excuse me," I said, pushing my chair back abruptly. "I need some air." As I stepped outside, the cold morning air stung my face, but it couldn't numb the fire burning inside me. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was war. Later that week, I got a call from my aunt, my dad's sister, Aunt Linda. She was the only family member who had consistently been on my side since Julia and Chloe entered the picture. "I heard about the will," she said without preamble. Her voice was tight with frustration. "Sarah, this is unbelievable. How could he do this to you?" I sighed, gripping the phone tighter. "It's not just about the money, Aunt Linda. It's the principle. It's like I don't even exist to him anymore." "That's not true," she said firmly. "Your father loves you. He's just easily influenced." Julia's always had a way of wrapping him around her finger. I wanted to argue, to defend the dad I used to know, but the truth was staring me in the face. Julia had turned him into someone I barely recognized. Then Aunt Linda dropped the bombshell. "You know, your grandparents left a significant inheritance to both you and your father when they passed. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but that money was meant to secure your future." I froze. "What are you talking about?" "It was split 50-50 between you and your dad," she explained. He was supposed to hold on to your portion until you turned 25. I assumed you already had access to it. My mind raced. I had never seen a penny of that money. Not a word had been mentioned about it. Are you sure about this? I asked, my voice trembling. Positive, Aunt Linda said. It was outlined clearly in their will. I even have a copy of the documents. Anger surged through me like a tidal wave. If what Aunt Linda was saying was true, then my father hadn't just sidelined me in favor of Chloe. He had stolen from me. Can you send me those documents? I asked, my voice steadier now, fueled by determination. Of course, she said. Sarah, don't let this go. You deserve better than this. As I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking, but not from fear. If my dad thought he could get away with taking what was mine, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. That evening, I sat at my desk, the email from Aunt Linda open on my laptop. Attached were scans of my grandparents' will, and there it was in black and white. 50% of their estate was meant for me. The other half had been left to my dad, with explicit instructions that my portion was to be held in trust until I turned 25. I stared at the document, anger bubbling beneath the surface. My father hadn't just betrayed me by favoring Chloe, he had actively stolen my inheritance to benefit her. My mind replayed every instance where he had dismissed my concerns, every time Julia and Chloe had been prioritized over me. Now, it all made sense. I needed to confront him, but not without a plan. I spent hours researching legal options, calling lawyers to understand my rights. Each conversation confirmed what I had feared. My father had violated the terms of the will. I could take legal action to reclaim what was mine. The next day, I visited Aunt Linda. She welcomed me with a warm hug, her expression filled with concern. You look like you haven't slept, she said, leading me into the kitchen. I haven't, I admitted, showing her the notes I had compiled. I'm going to confront him, but I want to make sure I have everything I need. I can't let him and Julia get away with this. Aunt Linda nodded. Good. They've been taking advantage of you for far too long. But Sarah, be careful. Julia won't let this go quietly. Her warning lingered in my mind as I drove to my parents' house that afternoon. When I arrived, Julia was in the living room, flipping through a magazine while Chloe scrolled on her phone. Oh, look who decided to visit, Julia said, her tone dripping with mockery. I need to talk to Dad, I said firmly, ignoring her. He's in his study, Julia replied, raising an eyebrow. Don't upset him too much, dear. He's had a long day. I marched to the study, my heart pounding. As I opened the door, my father looked up from his desk, surprised. Sarah, what's this about? I held up the will. We need to talk. My father's face went pale as he saw the document in my hand. His usual air of authority faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a strained smile. What's this about, Sarah? He asked, his voice carefully measured. I placed the printed pages on his desk, pointing to the relevant section. Care to explain why the inheritance from Grandma and Grandpa never reached me? This clearly states that half of their estate was meant for me, yet I haven't seen a single cent. He glanced at the papers, his eyes narrowing. Sarah, it's complicated. That money? It's not complicated, I interrupted, my voice firm. You were supposed to hold it in trust until I turned 25. I'm 27 now. Where is it? His expression hardened. I used it for the family. Do you think raising a child like Chloe and maintaining this household comes cheap? Everyone has to make sacrifices. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sacrifices? You mean you sacrificed my future for Chloe's lifestyle? Watch your tone, he snapped, his voice rising. Julia and I made decisions that were best for the family. For the family, I shot back. Or for Julia and Chloe, because it sure seems like their needs have always come first. No matter the cost to me. He stood up, leaning on the desk. This conversation is over, Sarah. You're being selfish and ungrateful. Do you know how much I've done for you over the years? I didn't flinch. This isn't about gratitude, Dad. It's about fairness, and what's legally mine. If you think I'm going to let this slide, you're wrong. As I turned to leave, Julia appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. What's going on here? She demanded. Nothing that concerns you, I said coldly, brushing past her. Oh, it concerns me, she called after me. Everything in this house concerns me, and you'd better think twice before you start making threats, Sarah. It won't end well for you. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but they also fueled my resolve. If Julia wanted a fight, I was more than ready to give her one. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the city lights through the window. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Aunt Linda. Did you confront him? She asked, her voice cautious. Yes, I said, sighing. He admitted to using the money for family expenses. And Julia, she's already acting like this is some sort of war. She always has been, Aunt Linda said with a hint of bitterness. But Sarah, this is your chance to stand your ground. You can't let them manipulate you anymore. Her words resonated, but they didn't ease the knot in my stomach. I had spent years seeking my father's approval, even as he pushed me aside. Taking legal action felt like the right thing to do, but it also meant severing what little connection we had left. As I sat there, a thought crept into my mind. What if I walked away? What if I stopped fighting and let them have everything? It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. But was it worth losing my family over? The next morning, I went for a walk to clear my head. Passing a park, I saw a father playing catch with his daughter. Her laughter echoed in the crisp morning air, and my chest tightened. Memories of simpler times flooded back. When Dad used to take me to the same park, back when it was just the two of us. I shook my head, pushing the memories aside. Those moments belonged to a different version of him, one who had cared about me before Julia and Chloe had entered the picture. Later that day, I met with my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel. She reviewed the documents I had brought, nodding as she flipped through them. "You have a strong case," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Your father violated the terms of the trust, and we can prove it. But Sarah," she paused, looking at me over her glasses, "this won't be easy. Your stepmom will likely push back hard, and it might get ugly." "I know," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves twisting in my stomach. "But I can't keep letting them walk all over me. This isn't just about the money. It's about standing up for myself." 2 days after my meeting with Rachel, I received an unexpected text from Chloe. "Chloe, can we talk?" I stared at the message for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. Chloe and I had never been close. She was Julia's golden child, after all. But curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to meet her at a nearby cafe. When I arrived, Chloe was already seated, nervously stirring a cup of tea. She looked up as I approached, her usual smug expression replaced by something I hadn't seen before: guilt. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "What's this about, Chloe?" I asked, sitting down and crossing my arms. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. "I overheard Mom and your dad talking," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They're planning to contest anything you bring to court. Mom said she has ways to discredit you if you try to fight back." I felt my stomach drop. "Discredit me? How?" "She didn't say," Chloe admitted, looking genuinely uneasy. "But Mom can be ruthless when she wants something. I thought you should know." I studied her carefully, trying to gauge her intentions. "Why are you telling me this? You're benefiting from all of this, aren't you?" Chloe looked down, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said quietly. "I never told Mom to put my name on the will, and I didn't know about your inheritance until now. I don't want things to get ugly, Sarah." "Then give it up," I said bluntly. "Tell them you don't want the house or the money. Let them know it's not fair." Her silence spoke volumes. "I can't," she whispered finally. "Mom would never forgive me." I stood up, grabbing my bag. "Then stay out of my way, Chloe, because if your mom wants a fight, I'm ready for one." As I walked out of the cafe, my mind raced with possibilities. What kind of dirt could Julia possibly have on me? Whatever it was, I couldn't let her intimidate me. If she wanted a battle, she was about to get one. The cafe meeting with Chloe left me uneasy. Her warning about Julia's intentions played on a loop in my head as I sat down that evening to sort through old photos and documents. Somewhere in these piles of memories, I hoped to find something that could help my case. As I sifted through albums and files, I stumbled upon a photograph that made me pause. It was an old family picture taken before Julia entered our lives. Dad, me, and my mom. We were at a beach, smiling as the sun set behind us. The memory brought a bittersweet pang, but it also reminded me of a time when Dad had been someone else, someone who prioritized family over convenience. I tucked the photo into my purse. I needed to confront him one last time before things escalated further. The next day, I showed up at my dad's office unannounced. He looked startled to see me but waved me in. "What's this about, Sarah?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, his tone guarded. "I want to know why," I said, placing the family photo on his desk. "Why would you choose them over me, over us?" He picked up the photo, his expression softening for a moment before hardening again. "Sarah, this isn't about choosing sides. It's about doing what's best for everyone." "Everyone?" I shot back. "Or just Julia and Chloe? Because I'm not seeing where I fit into that equation." He sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, Sarah, Julia has been under a lot of stress trying to ensure Chloe has a good start in life. Don't, I interrupted, my voice trembling with anger. Don't use her stress as an excuse to take away what was supposed to be mine. I've worked for everything I have, Dad. I've never asked for anything, and this is how you repay me. I didn't think you'd understand, he said weakly. You're right, I replied, standing. I don't, but you'll understand soon enough when this goes to court. His eyes widened in shock as I walked out, slamming the door behind me. I didn't want this fight, but if he and Julia were going to make me the villain, I was ready to play the role. The day after my confrontation with Dad, I received a letter from their lawyer. My heart sank as I opened it, my hands trembling. The contents were worse than I had imagined. Julia was officially contesting my claims to any inheritance, stating that Dad had the right to distribute his assets as he saw fit. They were doubling down, and the gloves were off. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the letter. My phone buzzed beside me, and when I saw the caller ID, I almost didn't answer. But something compelled me to pick up. Sarah, Rachel's voice came through, calm but urgent. We need to talk. I found something. What is it? I asked, gripping the phone tightly. I reviewed Julia's financial records, she said. There's a series of questionable transactions, large withdrawals, unaccounted for expenses. It looks like she's been draining your father's personal accounts for years. This could be our leverage. My pulse quickened. Are you sure? Positive, Rachel replied. And there's more. Chloe's name appears on some of these transactions, as though she's been directly benefiting. It's not just favoritism, it's mismanagement and exploitation. If we present this in court, it could completely discredit Julia's case. A mix of relief and fury coursed through me. Julia hadn't just manipulated Dad, she'd been actively exploiting him. That evening, I gathered every piece of evidence Rachel had compiled and prepared to confront Dad one final time. Armed with the truth, I drove to the house. When I arrived, I wasn't surprised to find Julia and Chloe in the living room, laughing over a glass of wine as though nothing was amiss. The sight fueled my determination. I need to talk to Dad, I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Julia's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. He's resting, Sarah. It's late. It won't take long, I replied coldly. She didn't argue, but her eyes narrowed as I made my way to his study. When I entered, Dad looked up from his desk, surprised to see me. This ends now, I said, placing the file of evidence on his desk. You need to see the truth, Dad, before it's too late. As he opened the file and began to read, the color drained from his face. Dad sat in silence, his eyes darting across the pages of evidence Rachel and I had meticulously compiled. His hands trembled as he flipped through each document. Bank statements, checks signed by Julia, and receipts tied to Chloe's frivolous spending. This can't be right, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. It's all there, I said, my tone unyielding. Julia's been siphoning money from your accounts, Dad, for years, and Chloe's been in on it. This isn't just favoritism, it's fraud. His expression shifted from disbelief to anger, his jaw tightening. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I tried, I replied, my voice rising. You didn't want to hear it. You were too busy defending them, convincing yourself that they needed you more than I did. The door creaked open, and Julia stepped inside, her face pale but her demeanor defiant. What's going on here? She demanded, her voice sharp. Dad looked up at her, his face flushed with a mix of betrayal and rage. Is it true, Julia? Did you take money from my accounts without telling me? Her eyes darted to the folder on the desk, and for a moment, she faltered. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice steady. Sarah's always been jealous, trying to turn you against me. You can't seriously believe this nonsense. I stepped forward, holding my ground. It's not nonsense, and you know it. The proof is right here. You've been manipulating Dad from the start, using his trust to fund your lifestyle and Chloe's whims. You thought you'd get away with it, but now the truth is out. Julia turned to Dad, her voice desperate. You're not going to let her ruin everything we've built, are you? After everything I've done for you. Dad stood, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Enough, Julia, he said, his voice firm for the first time in years. I trusted you, and you betrayed me. This ends now. The tension in the room was electric as Julia's face contorted with fury. You'll regret this, she spat before storming out. Dad turned to me, his shoulders slumping. What do we do now, Sarah? Dad sank back into his chair, his face a mixture of exhaustion and shame. For the first time, I saw the weight of his decisions truly settling on him. "I don't know how I let it get this far," he said quietly, his voice cracking. "Because you trusted the wrong people," I replied, softening slightly. "But it's not too late to fix this, Dad. You have the evidence. You can take action." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "What do you suggest I do?" Before I could respond, the sound of raised voices erupted from the hallway. Julia and Chloe were arguing, loudly. I could hear Chloe's shrill complaints about how ungrateful I was and Julia trying to calm her down, her tone veering between anger and desperation. I looked back at Dad. "You need to take control, now. Confront them both, lay down the law, and make things right. If you don't, they'll continue to exploit you, and you'll lose everything." A flicker of determination crossed his face as he stood up. "You're right," he said firmly. "I owe it to you, to myself, to end this." We walked out of the study together, finding Julia and Chloe in the living room. Julia was pacing, her hands flailing as she tried to explain the situation to Chloe, who sat on the couch, arms crossed, her expression one of pure entitlement. "You've been lying to me," Dad said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Both women froze, turning to look at him. "Bill, you don't understand," Julia began, but he held up a hand to silence her. "No, Julia, I understand perfectly. You've been using me, draining my accounts, and spoiling Chloe at my expense. And now it stops. I'm contacting my lawyer first thing tomorrow to rewrite my will and freeze our shared accounts." Chloe stood up, her face twisted in outrage. "You can't do that. I deserve this. I'm your daughter too." Dad's voice was cold as steel. "You're not my daughter, Chloe. You're Julia's. And it's time she starts taking care of you on her own." Julia's face turned red as she sputtered. "You'll regret this, Bill." But Dad didn't waver. "No, Julia. The only thing I regret is letting it go this far." The next morning, Dad kept his word. I accompanied him to his lawyer's office, where he laid everything out: the fraudulent transfers, the evidence of manipulation, and his decision to rewrite his will. The lawyer, a seasoned professional with a stern demeanor, listened attentively before nodding. "This is a clear case of financial exploitation," she said, flipping through the documents we'd provided. "We'll draft the new will immediately and initiate the process to reclaim the funds taken from your accounts." Dad sat up straighter, his resolve evident. "I want Sarah to be the primary beneficiary," he said firmly. "She's the one who's been there for me. She deserves this." Hearing those words, I felt a wave of emotions: vindication, relief, and a bittersweet sense of pride. After years of being overlooked, I was finally being seen, but the fallout at home was swift and brutal. Julia and Chloe exploded when they found out about the new will. Julia stormed into Dad's study, waving the document she had intercepted from the lawyer's office. "You're cutting us out. After everything I've done for you?" she shrieked. "You mean after everything you've taken from me?" Dad shot back, his voice steady. "I've enabled you for too long, Julia. It's over. I'm filing for divorce." Chloe tried to interject, but Dad cut her off. "And you, Chloe, it's time you stand on your own 2 feet. You're an adult now. It's not my responsibility to fund your lifestyle." The room went silent, save for Julia's sharp breaths. "You'll regret this, Bill," she spat before storming out. Chloe followed, slamming the door behind her. In the weeks that followed, Dad and I worked together to rebuild. He moved forward with the divorce, cut off Julia's access to his accounts, and started focusing on repairing our relationship. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Dad turned to me, his expression soft. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, "for everything. I let you down, but I'm so proud of the woman you've become." Tears welled in my eyes as I smiled. "It's okay, Dad. We're here now, and that's what matters." Months later, the house felt lighter, both literally and figuratively. Julia and Chloe were gone, leaving behind only the echoes of their entitled demands. Dad had found a renewed sense of purpose, volunteering at the local community center and reconnecting with old friends. The man who had once been manipulated into blind generosity was now standing tall, confident in his decisions. As for me, I'd gained more than just my rightful inheritance. I'd gained clarity about my own worth. No longer was I the forgotten daughter, fighting for scraps of attention and approval. I was someone who had stood up for herself, even when it was hard, and in doing so, had reclaimed her voice. The changes didn't come without challenges. There were messy court battles with Julia, who tried to contest the divorce settlement, and Chloe's endless attempts to guilt Dad into reversing his decisions. But each time, we stood firm. With every legal victory, every small step toward freedom, I felt a weight lift from both of us. One evening, while sorting through old family albums, I found a photo of Dad and me at a park from years ago. I was sitting on his shoulders, laughing as he pointed out the ducks in the pond. It was a reminder of the bond we'd always had, even when it had been strained by circumstances beyond our control. "Remember this?" I asked, showing him the photo. He chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I do. You were so curious about everything back then. You kept asking me why the ducks didn't sink." I smiled. "And you told me it was because they kept moving forward no matter what." Dad nodded, his expression thoughtful. "A good lesson, isn't it? Just keep moving forward." As the sun set that evening, casting golden light across the room, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. For the first time in years, I could look at my family, not the broken pieces it had been, but the strong foundation we were building, and feel hopeful about the future. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight with those closest to us. But standing up for yourself, even when it feels impossible, is always worth it. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more inspiring stories. And remember, the best revenge is building a life you can be proud of.